His crew included, his co-pilot was Jim Rittner, who was also an experienced pilot in his own right with nearly 7,000 flying hours, and who had also completed his last flight earlier the previous day. Flight engineer was Forrest Breifogel, and primary flight engineer was Forrest Breifogel, I should say. There was also a second flight engineer, Harry Allen, on board, and as best as anyone is able to tell at this point, he was basically deadheading traveling as a passenger on board the aircraft. He was heading back to Kansas City. He'd been training out in Los Angeles, or just recently been assigned out there, and was going back to visit family members in Kansas City. And these are the pictures of these folks. Also on board were two female flight crew members, which were known as hostesses back in those days on TWA. Tracy Armbruster was the senior hostess. She'd been with the airline for 6 years. And Beth Davis had been with the airline for 3 years. Beth was actually one of the first people that I learned a lot about. Talking to her sister is one of the things that motivated me to write this book. She was already a college graduate, as most of the stewardesses, hostesses back in those days were either college graduates or registered nurses or both. Beth had graduated from William and Mary College, and she'd recently received a full scholarship to go back and get her master's in education. And she was actually scheduled within the month to quit flying and get ready to go back to school. And she told her family that one of the reasons she was happy about this was that within the industry it was well known that there had been a lot of near misses, and she was somewhat concerned about that. These are the rest of the folks that were on the flight. This is actually the first half of them. There were 64 passengers, so a total of 70 people on board for TWA Flight 2 that day. And this is the second half of the list here. And I'm going to just talk about a few of the individuals on board. I wish I had the time, in some cases, the information to tell you something about all of them. I'm going to just go through and let you know about a few of them. There was, on both airplanes, a wide range of people in terms of ages, socioeconomic background, and reasons that they were traveling. There was a mother and two little girls. The mother was Esther Broughton, and Connie and Linda were her two daughters. They were 6 and 9. And they were returning from a vacation. Janice Heiser was actually the college graduate getting ready to go back for more school's roommate and fellow hostess at TWA. And she had completed her flying assignments for the month, and she was again deadheading, just traveling back as a passenger on board Beth's flight. The Kites were an entire family from Kansas City. They had taken their two little girls, Sharon and Linda, who were also 6 and 9, out to California to see Disneyland, which had opened up the previous summer. And they were on their way home from their vacation. Joe Kite worked as an administrative assistant at TWA headquarters here in Kansas City. Richard Noel was, as far as the newspapers of the day were concerned, at least probably the most prominent passenger on board. He was a investment broker. He was had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange and was on the boards of directors of several corporations. And he was traveling with his wife, heading back east. Robert Sanders was an interesting guy. He was a 21-year-old who was actually traveling on a borrowed employee pass of a TWA employee named Miller. And it was thought for a few days after the crash that Mr. Miller of TWA had died in the crash. And it was eventually found out that it was actually Bob Sanders had died. And I've never heard a lot of details beyond this, but the word within the retired TWA community is that Mr. Miller was not with the airline very long after they found that out. And then the last person I'm going to talk about from Flight 2 is Gloria Townsend. She was 33 years old. She worked as a telegraph operator, or teletype operator for TWA. And she was, as the newspapers in those days usually pointed out, if they knew about it, she was a divorced woman. She had a young daughter named Jinx who lived with her father back in Kansas City. Gloria worked in Los Angeles, and she was going back to Kansas City to pick up her daughter and bring her back to California for the summer. Just another one of the little tidbits about her that was mentioned in the employee newsletter after the crash. She was Miss Kansas City in 1940. Angeles DC-7. And this aircraft also had a name. It was the Mainliner Vancouver. And it was, again, one of the state-of-the-art aircraft flying in those days. It was just a little bit faster than the Super Constellation. Again, they were both state-of-the-art airliners. In the ad campaigns that both airlines had running, the DC-7s were, since they were the fastest airliners going, that was what the airlines bragged on. And they had a whole series of ads. I believe there may be some in this book over here talking about if whatever your reason you need to get there as fast as possible, take a DC-7. And TWA's response was basically take one of our Super Constellations. They're just almost as fast and they're really, really comfortable. As you can see in the seating arrangement here, there's a horseshoe-shaped lounge in the back of this aircraft, and then the assigned seating was further up here. This aircraft had a top cruising speed of 345 miles an hour, which, like I say, is just a little faster than the Constellation, and this will play into the crash here shortly. We'll talk more about that. There are no known pictures among the small group of people that have studied this crash in detail of the actual Mainliner Vancouvers, but these are identical sister ships of that aircraft. I want to point out in one feature on it here, you notice they have the tips of the propellers painted red, white, and blue, so they made these red, white, and blue circles, and this will also be something that will be significant later on. This particular aircraft was actually the newer of the two involved in the crash. It was also a California native built at Douglas's plant in Santa Monica, California, and it had only been placed in service the previous year, and it had about half the hours on that the TWA plane had. But again, these were both aircraft in the prime of their lives, so to speak. On board, we had a Los Angeles-based flight crew in this case. We had Captain Robert Shirley, 48, who was, had even a few more hours than Captain Gandy did. He'd been flying for 16,000 with 1,238 in the DC-7. He's also been with United since the 1930s with this airline, and he had flown nonstop throughout the war as an airline pilot. He had, the exact number of times he'd flown this route isn't known, but he had flown it on a regular basis, and he had been off actually for quite a while. He'd been off for most of the week. His flight crew included Robert Harms, who was his co-pilot. He'd been with United for quite a while. In fact, he was a captain in his own right on the DC-3, at that time one of the smaller, older aircraft that they had in their fleet. And flight engineer was Giardo, or as he was known, Jerry Fiore. He started, as a lot of flight engineers did back in those days, as a mechanic with the airline. In fact, most of the flight engineers in the 1950s on the airlines were qualified mechanics. This kind of reflects, among other things, one of the differences in the airline industry then versus now. It was still very much a growing industry, going into a lot of places that didn't have a lot of modern facilities. In fact, the Super Constellation had a little thing that you'll see in the flight manual over here. If you were going through the attic, it had chutes for parachute flares. So if you were landing at night at an airport that did not have airport lighting, you could actually drop flares to illuminate the runway. There were two stewardesses, as they were called by United in those days, on board Flight 718, Nancy Kimmins, who had been with the airline since February of '54, and Margaret Shout, who'd been with the airline since a little bit later in that same year. These were the passengers on board. There were 53 passengers, and like the TWA flight, it was also a full aircraft. This was the Saturday in 1956, before the middle of the week 4th of July holiday. Some of the people on board these flights included Phyllis Berman, who is the head of the volunteers for the City of Hope charity organization in Los Angeles. Elizabeth and Jeffrey Kreider, and I apologize for the quality of the picture, but in a lot of cases, all I have is newspaper clippings. Elizabeth and Jeffrey were mother and son. Carl Snyder was the kind of the celebrity passenger as far as the media was concerned in those days on board Flight 718. He was one of about half a dozen people that ran Chrysler in those days. He was the head of manufacturing for Chrysler.